The crisp Melbourne air bit at Crystal Mitchell's face as she stepped out of her home in the early hours of the morning. It was a routine she had followed for years, waking up before the sun, preparing for work, and setting out on her bicycle, weaving through the familiar streets toward the office. But today wasn't just another morning. Today she carried something precious. She patted her pocket, feeling the thick bundle of cash inside. $8,000, a small fortune in neatly stacked bills, freshly obtained from the sale of her husband's prized ride-on lawnmower. The money had a purpose. It was meant to go directly into their mortgage offset account, a step toward securing their future, a relief in a world where every dollar counted. As she adjusted her gloves and mounted her bicycle, Crystal couldn't shake off the weight of responsibility. It wasn't every day she carried such an amount. Her husband had handed her the money with a trusting smile that morning. "Be careful with it, yeah?" he had said. "Of course," she had laughed, pocketing the cash securely. She wasn't worried. She had done this ride 100 times. Pedaling through the streets, the city was just beginning to wake. Shops had started rolling up their shutters, early commuters sipped takeaway coffee, and delivery trucks idled at intersections. Her mind wandered as she enjoyed the cool breeze against her skin. She barely noticed the hum of life around her, the mechanical rhythm of her legs propelling her forward, the familiar landmarks passing by. Minutes turned to miles, and before she knew it, she had reached her workplace. She locked her bicycle, stretched her legs, and took a deep breath. It was only when she reached into her pocket that her world tilted on its axis. The pocket was empty. Her breath caught. Her hands searched frantically. First her jacket, then her pants. Nothing. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. The money. The $8,000. Gone. Her heart pounded as her mind reeled. Had she zipped her pocket? Had it fallen out on the road? Had someone seen it? A tight knot of panic twisted in her stomach. This couldn't be happening. With trembling hands, she wheeled her bike around and ran back outside, scanning the pavement, her eyes darting in every direction. Maybe it fell near the entrance. Maybe it was just on the ground somewhere nearby. But deep inside, a sickening fear had already taken root. Somewhere in Melbourne, $8,000 in cash was missing, and Crystal had no idea where to begin. Crystal's pulse pounded in her ears as she sprinted down the sidewalk, her eyes scanning every crack and corner of the pavement. The morning commuters barely gave her a glance as she frantically retraced her steps, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It has to be here somewhere," she muttered under her breath. "It has to be." She forced herself to think. When was the last time I checked my pocket? Was it still there when I was riding? She couldn't remember. The ride had been routine, automatic. Had she felt the weight of the cash when she shifted position on her bike? Had it slipped out as she sped down a hill? Her mind was a whirlwind of possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. Determined not to waste time, she sprinted back to her office, grabbed her phone, and called her husband. "Hey, everything okay?" His voice was casual, oblivious to the chaos unfolding. She swallowed hard. "I lost it." There was a pause. "Lost what?" "The money." Her voice cracked. "The cash. It's gone." Another silence, this one heavier. Then a deep inhale. "Okay," he said carefully, the way someone speaks to a person teetering on the edge. "Where did you last see it?" "I don't know." She pressed a hand to her forehead, forcing herself to stay calm. "It was in my pocket when I left the house. I didn't check after that." "Okay, retrace your route. I'll head out and start looking too." She didn't waste another second. Leaving her bike at the office, she took off on foot, her eyes combing the ground with laser focus. She stopped at every intersection, checked gutters, peered under parked cars, even looked inside trash bins. Nothing. The thought of someone picking up the money twisted her stomach. Would they return it? Or would they see it as a lucky break and disappear with it? By the time she made it back to her house, her husband was already outside, scanning the street. He looked up as she approached, and the worry in his eyes mirrored her own. "Nothing?" he asked. She shook her head, her throat tightening. They scoured the driveway, the porch, even the bushes lining the fence. Still nothing. "Let's call the police," her husband said finally, "and maybe alert some local businesses. Someone might have found it." Crystal exhaled, trying to push back the creeping despair. Reporting a lost wallet was one thing, but $8,000 in loose cash? What were the chances anyone would turn it in? Still, she had no other choice. With shaky hands, she dialed the police. As she waited for them to pick up, she silently prayed that somewhere, someone had found the money, and that they would do the right thing. Crystal gripped her phone tightly as the police dispatcher took down the details. She tried to sound composed, but the quiver in her voice betrayed the rising panic within her. "You said it was in cash?" The officer on the other end asked, his tone neutral but laced with the unspoken reality. Lost cash rarely found its way back. "Yes," she answered, swallowing hard. $8,000. In my pocket. It must have fallen out during my bike ride to work." "All right, we've got that down. We'll notify patrols in your area and put out a lost property report. If anyone turns it in, we'll contact you immediately." Crystal thanked the officer, but as she ended the call, a wave of helplessness settled over her. If anyone turns it in. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder. "Come on, let's check with local businesses. Maybe someone saw something." They spent the next hour knocking on doors, explaining the situation to store owners, cafe workers, and street vendors. A few were sympathetic, shaking their heads with regret, but no one had seen a thing. By now, the morning rush had passed, and Crystal's hope was dwindling fast. The streets she had cycled through just hours ago felt different now. Emptier, indifferent to her silent desperation. She logged into a local community group on social media and posted an urgent plea. Lost. $8,000 in cash. Somewhere between her address and South Melbourne. If anyone finds it, please contact me. It was meant for our mortgage. Honest finder will be rewarded. She stared at the screen, waiting, praying, hoping someone, anyone, would respond. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing. Crystal slumped onto a bench, exhausted. "What if it's gone for good?" she whispered, voice hollow. Her husband sat beside her, rubbing his temples. "I won't lie. It's a lot of money. But we'll figure it out. It's not the end of the world." Tears welled in her eyes. She felt like she had failed. Not just herself, but him. The money had been a responsibility, a tangible piece of their future. And now it was slipping through their fingers. Her phone buzzed. She snatched it up, heart pounding. A notification from the community page, a comment. Her breath hitched as she read it. "Check with South Melbourne Police. A man might have turned something in." She stared at the words, unblinking. Could it be possible? Without hesitation, she jumped to her feet. "Let's go." Her husband blinked. "Where?" "The police station. Now." Crystal's heart raced as she and her husband rushed to the South Melbourne police station. Every step felt like an eternity, her mind a battlefield between hope and fear. What if it wasn't my money? What if it was just a misunderstanding? What if someone turned in a different amount? The station was a plain, sturdy building. Like all police stations, a place of authority, rules, and reality. But today, it felt like the gateway to fate. As they stepped inside, Crystal approached the front desk, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. The officer behind the glass gave her a neutral glance. "How can I help you?" She swallowed hard. I think someone may have turned in some money. A large amount. I lost it this morning." The officer's expression didn't change. He flipped through a few sheets of paper before standing up. "Give me a moment." Crystal's breathing shallowed as she watched him disappear into a back office. The seconds ticked by painfully. Her husband squeezed her hand. "No matter what happens, we'll be okay." She nodded, but her body was too tense to believe it. Then the officer returned, with another man. A middle-aged man in work clothes, his face kind but hesitant, stood beside the officer. He gave Crystal and her husband a small nod. "This is Paul," the officer said. "He turned in some cash this morning." Crystal's breath caught. Paul scratched the back of his head. "Yeah, I found it near an intersection. Scattered bills. Thought someone might be having a real bad day, so I brought it straight here." Crystal's hands trembled. It was $8,000? Paul nodded. "Didn't count it, but yeah, officer here confirmed the amount. You the one who lost it?" Tears welled in her eyes as she gave a shaky nod. "Yes. Oh my God. Yes." The officer spoke up. "You'll need to verify a few details before we can release it. But it looks like this belongs to you." Crystal couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. Relief, gratitude, and disbelief flooded through her as she turned to Paul. "You didn't have to do this," she whispered. "Most people wouldn't." Paul gave a small smile. Figured it wasn't mine to keep. Her husband stepped forward, gripping Paul's hand in a firm shake. "You don't know what this means to us." Paul shrugged, as if it were no big deal. But to Crystal, it was everything. As the officer prepared the paperwork, she turned to Paul. "We want to reward you. Something, anything, for your honesty." Paul chuckled. "Didn't do it for a reward, just did what felt right." Crystal wiped at her tears, still overwhelmed. She had feared the worst. But today, she had witnessed something rare. The undeniable proof that good, honest people still existed. And Paul was one of them. Crystal could hardly believe it. The nightmare that had consumed her entire day was over. The money, all of it, was safely back in her hands. But as she held the thick bundle of bills, neatly secured in a police evidence envelope, her focus wasn't on the money anymore. It was on Paul. This complete stranger had found $8,000 in the middle of the street and had walked straight into a police station to return it. No hesitation, no second thoughts. She turned to him, her emotions raw. "I don't even know how to thank you for this." Paul waved a dismissive hand. "No need. Just glad it found its way back to you." Crystal and her husband exchanged a glance. That wasn't good enough. People didn't do what Paul had done every day. In fact, most people wouldn't. Her husband cleared his throat. "Look, I know you say you don't want a reward, but we need to do something. Please, let us." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "You don't owe me anything." But Crystal wouldn't take no for an answer. She thought for a moment before an idea struck her. "Dinner. At the very least, let us take you out to dinner. A nice one. Our treat." Paul hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the attention, but Crystal wasn't going to let him walk away without knowing just how much this meant to them. She smiled. "Think of it this way. You're saving me from crying for the next week straight. That's got to be worth one dinner, right?" Paul laughed at that, scratching the back of his head. "Well, when you put it like that." Her husband clapped him on the shoulder. "Good. It's settled." As they finalized the paperwork at the police station, Crystal couldn't stop thinking about how differently this day could have ended. She had started her morning full of responsibility and confidence. She had plummeted into panic and despair, and now, because of a single act of honesty, she stood in a police station feeling more grateful than she had ever been in her life. And it wasn't just about the money. It was about knowing that, despite everything, despite how uncertain and unpredictable the world could be, there were still good people out there. People like Paul. As she and her husband left the police station, the money safely tucked into a secure bag this time, Crystal took a deep breath and smiled. Some days, life tested you in ways you never saw coming. And some days, it restored your faith in humanity. The weight that had crushed Crystal's chest all day was finally gone. As she and her husband walked back to their car, with the money safely secured in her bag, she felt lighter, not just because of the relief, but because of what she had witnessed today. Life had thrown her into a crisis. She had braced herself for the worst. Yet, against all odds, a stranger had chosen honesty over temptation. Later that evening, they met Paul at a cozy restaurant in South Melbourne. It wasn't the most extravagant place, but it was warm, inviting, and filled with laughter, a stark contrast to the panic-filled morning. As they sat down, Crystal couldn't help but study Paul. He wasn't someone who looked for attention. He was just an ordinary man, blue-collar, with hands that showed years of hard work, and an easygoing demeanor that made it seem like he had no idea what a rare person he truly was. "So, Paul," Crystal began, "you must have been tempted." "Even just for a second?" Paul shrugged as he cut into his steak. "Not really. Wasn't mine." Her husband laughed. "Just like that. That's rare, man." Paul smirked. "You'd be surprised. There's more good out there than people think." Crystal's eyes softened. Maybe he was right. As the evening went on, they talked about everything: work, life, Melbourne's unpredictable weather. Not once did Paul act like he had done something extraordinary, but Crystal knew better. Before they parted ways, she reached into her bag, pulling out a smaller envelope. "I know you didn't do this for a reward," she said carefully, "but please, let us give you something, even if it's just a small thank you." Paul glanced at the envelope, then back at her. For a moment, she thought he would refuse. But then he chuckled and took it. "All right, but only because you'd probably chase me down the street if I didn't." She grinned. "You're not wrong." As they left the restaurant, Crystal's heart felt full. She had gone through every emotion possible in a single day: responsibility, panic, fear, despair, hope, and finally, gratitude. Not just for getting the money back, but for being reminded that honest people still existed. That in a world full of uncertainty, there were still those who did the right thing simply because it was the right thing to do. And as she and her husband drove home, she held on to that feeling. Because in the end, some things are worth more than money.